If you enjoy deep Resident Evil lore, consider subscribing. It really helps the channel. Tricell wasn't a louder version of Umbrella. It was the next evolution. And once you understand how it operated, you start to realize Umbrella was never the real problem. In the year 2003, the world witnessed an event that many believed would signal the end of the biological nightmare. Following a high-tier military raid on the Caucasus facility in Russia, a court officially declared the Umbrella Corporation bankrupt and legally dissolved. For decades, the red and white umbrella had been the global symbol of pharmaceutical dominance and secret viral research. But under the weight of mounting lawsuits and the testimony of survivors like Jill Valentine and Chris Redfield, the empire finally buckled. The official narrative was that the monster had been slain. The public was led to believe that with the fall of Oswell Spencer's company, the threat of the T virus and the BOW industry would simply vanish into the history books. However, for those working within the clinical reality of the bioweapon market, the death of Umbrella was not an ending, but a dispersal. The day Umbrella died was actually the birth of a much more dangerous and fractured landscape. While the Umbrella name had become radioactive and toxic to any legitimate investor, the research, data, and viral samples they left behind were considered priceless by the world's shadow powers. The collapse of the corporation created a massive global power vacuum. In the late 1990s, Umbrella held a virtual monopoly on viral research, but after 2003, that intellectual property was scattered across the black market. This vacuum drew in established shipping, agricultural, and pharmaceutical giants who had spent years watching Umbrella from the sidelines. These corporations, such as Tricell, saw the mess left behind by Spencer not as a tragedy, but as a market opportunity. They realized that they could quietly absorb the remnants of Umbrella's research without ever having to associate themselves with the tainted branding of the original company. The clinical sorrow of this period was the realization that bioterrorism did not stop with Umbrella. It simply went underground. The world's governments and private military contractors still had a high demand for biological organic weapons, and the sudden disappearance of the primary supplier meant that new middlemen had to step in to fill the void. This led to a period of biological scavenging, where former Umbrella scientists were headhunted and secret laboratories were raided for any remaining data. Tricell, through its extensive global logistics and shipping networks, was in the perfect position to facilitate this transition. They understood that Umbrella's primary mistake was its visibility. By being a visible villain, Umbrella invited the kind of international scrutiny that eventually led to its bankruptcy. The new era required a company that could operate in the open, hiding its biological crimes beneath the layer of legitimate humanitarian and agricultural aid. By the time the final legal documents were signed in 2004, the legacy of 1998 had already been integrated into the corporate DNA of Tricell and its subsidiaries. The fall of Umbrella proved that a centralized empire was vulnerable to legal and physical attack. The survivors of the Raccoon City incident thought they had won the war, but they had only destroyed the flagship of a much larger and more decentralized fleet. The day Umbrella died was the day the biohazard threat became a permanent and invisible part of the global economy. Tricell watched the collapse with clinical detachment, preparing to take the stage as the professional, efficient successor to the Spencer legacy. They were the scavengers who inherited the earth, and their reign would prove to be far more lethal than anything Umbrella had ever attempted. The fundamental truth of the Resident Evil world is that the demand for bioweapons did not vanish when the Umbrella Corporation collapsed. In many ways, it actually intensified. By the mid-2000s, world governments, rogue states, and private military organizations had realized that viral pathogens were the ultimate clean weapons of mass destruction. Unlike a nuclear strike, which leaves behind a radioactive wasteland and undeniable evidence of the aggressor, a viral outbreak can be framed as a natural disaster or an unfortunate accident. This provides the user with total plausible deniability while achieving the same tactical goal of destabilizing a region or erasing a population. Because the desire for power and control is a constant in human politics, the biological market was always going to find a new primary supplier. Corporations like Tricell recognized that they could act as the perfect middleman in this new era. They understood that the global security apparatus was desperate for biological assets, but could no longer be seen dealing with a company that had a public history of human experimentation and urban destruction. Tricell stepped into this role with a clinical focus on plausible deniability as a core corporate policy. They realized that Umbrella's downfall was rooted in its hubris and its desire to be a global hegemon. The new model required a corporation that was already deeply integrated into the world's vital infrastructure, such as food production and international shipping. By replacing Umbrella, Tricell wasn't just selling monsters, they were selling the infrastructure of survival, which gave them a level of leverage that Umbrella never truly possessed. The clinical reality of the post-2003 world was that someone had to replace Umbrella to prevent the bioweapon market from becoming a chaotic and uncontrollable Wild West. International agencies like the BSAA were created to monitor these threats, but they too were often dependent on the very corporations they were supposed to regulate. Tricell positioned itself as a partner to these organizations, providing funding and research data while secretly continuing the very experiments they were supposedly fighting against. This parasitic relationship ensured that the company remained untouchable. They were the ones providing the vaccines and the humanitarian aid in the wake of outbreaks, which allowed them to control the narrative and harvest the resulting data. It was a perfect, self-sustaining cycle of infection and intervention. Ultimately, the demand for bioweapons is driven by the desire for a biological edge in global conflict. When Umbrella fell, every nation that had been secretly buying their research was suddenly left vulnerable. Tricell filled this void by offering a more refined and professional category of service. They moved the industry away from the experimental and often unstable viral leaks of the 1990s and toward a model of calculated deployment. They proved that the business of life was too profitable to ever truly disappear. The world needed a new Umbrella, not because the old one was successful, but because the market it created had become a permanent part of the global security landscape. Tricell was the inevitable answer to a question that humanity refused to stop asking. Publicly, Tricell was the antithesis of the cold and secretive Umbrella Corporation. They were a massive, multi-industrial conglomerate with roots that stretched back to the 19th century through the Travis Enterprises shipping line. By the time of the 2009 Kijuju incident, Tricell was known as a global leader in three primary sectors, which were agriculture, pharmaceuticals, and humanitarian aid. This public identity was meticulously crafted to project an image of a company dedicated to the future of humanity. They were the ones building irrigation systems in drought-stricken regions and providing low-cost medicine to developing nations. This philanthropic mask allowed them to operate in regions that would have been closed to a traditional military or pharmaceutical company, giving them unprecedented access to vulnerable populations and sensitive geographical sites. Africa was the perfect cover for Tricell's dual identity. Under the guise of developing nations aid, the company built massive infrastructure projects across the continent, including hospitals, research centers, and transport hubs. These projects were heralded as a victory for international cooperation. But beneath the soil, Tricell was constructing something far more sinister. Every legitimate medical clinic in a place like Kijuju served as a front for a subterranean viral laboratory. This allowed the company to move research equipment and viral samples under the labels of medical supplies and emergency aid, bypassing traditional customs inspections and military oversight. They were hiding their biological crimes in the open, using the world's desire for humanitarian progress as a shield for their research into the Uroboros and the Type 2 plagas. The clinical reality of Tricell's public identity was its ability to avoid suspicion through its sheer scale and integration into daily life. You couldn't nuke a Tricell facility without potentially disrupting the food supply or the medical logistics of an entire continent. Unlike Umbrella, which was largely a pharmaceutical and military entity, Tricell was a total logistics company. They controlled the ships that moved the goods, the farms that grew the food, and the labs that made the medicine. This made them a structural part of the global economy, rendering them too big to fail in the eyes of many world leaders. This was the ultimate evolution of corporate survival. By becoming essential to the world's survival, Tricell ensured that no one would look too closely at the darkness hiding behind their humanitarian banners. The sorrow of Tricell's public identity lies in the betrayal of those who believed in their mission. The villagers in Kijuju viewed the Tricell clinics as a sign of hope, a way out of the poverty and disease that had plagued their region for generations. They didn't know that the doctors in the white coats were actually data analysts monitoring their transformation into biological weapons. Tricell turned the concept of global aid into a delivery system for the apocalypse. Their public identity was the perfect lie, a clinical masterpiece of corporate branding that allowed them to dismantle the human species while receiving international awards for their service to humanity. They were the corporation that replaced Umbrella by perfecting the art of the masquerade. Umbrella was built on the model of a centralized empire, a structure that proved to be its ultimate undoing. Oswald Spencer operated the company as his personal kingdom, where every major decision and every high-tier viral sample eventually found its way back to his inner circle. This centralization meant that if you cut off the head of the empire, the entire body would eventually collapse. When the Raccoon City incident occurred and the legal battles began, the focus was entirely on Umbrella's central leadership and its primary laboratories. This visible target made it easy for the international community to dismantle the company once the evidence became undeniable. Tricell, however, adopted a decentralized model that was designed for survival in an age of high scrutiny and digital surveillance. Tricell's corporate model was a web of shell companies, independent research branches, and decentralized regional offices. They didn't have a single evil headquarters that could be raided by the BSAA to end the threat. Instead, they operated as a network of autonomous cells, each one with its own budget, its own staff, and its own layers of plausible deniability. If a project in the Kijuju region was compromised, the global headquarters in Europe could simply claim it was the work of a rogue regional director, acting without authorization. This allowed the parent company to remain legally untouchable, while the fallout was contained to a single, disposable branch. This model turned Tricell into a biological cancer that was integrated into the system, making it nearly impossible to excise without killing the host. The clinical reality of this model was the erasure of the celebrity scientist. In Umbrella, names like William Birkin and Alexia Ashford were known to the leadership and often became focal points for the company's pride and eventual downfall. Tricell preferred a model of anonymous efficiency. Their researchers were cogs in a larger machine, their work fragmented across different facilities so that no single person held the keys to the kingdom. This ensured that even if a scientist was captured or defected, the amount of actionable data they could provide was limited. Tricell prioritized the process over the individual, a cold mechanical approach that removed the variable of human ego and emotion from their biological research. It was a model designed for a world where the company was the only thing that mattered. Furthermore, Tricell's model allowed them to be more reactive to the global market. Because they were decentralized, they could establish a new research hub in any region that provided the right combination of limited oversight and a vulnerable population. They were a mobile and adaptive threat, capable of relocating their entire biological assets in a matter of weeks if they detected an incoming investigation. Umbrella was a mansion on a hill that refused to move. Tricell was the fog that covered the valley, impossible to catch and constantly shifting its shape. This was the corporate model that allowed them to outlive the legacy of Spencer and become the primary architect of the biohazard world in the late 2000s. They were the perfect evolution of corporate villainy, designed for a century that no longer believed in kings, but in the power of the network. Part 5. Excella Gionne's Rise. The rise of Excella Gionne within the hierarchy of Tricell is a study in clinical ambition and the pursuit of a lost legacy. As a descendant of the Travis family, the founders of the original shipping line that became Tricell, Excella was born with the weight of corporate history on her shoulders. She was a child prodigy, possessing an intellect that allowed her to graduate from university at a remarkably young age, with degrees in genetic engineering and business management. However, her primary motivation was not scientific discovery, but the restoration of the Gionne family's status. She felt that her branch of the family had been sidelined by the larger Tricell board, and she was determined to use her beauty, her intellect, and her ruthless ambition to reclaim her birthright as the leader of the company's global operations. Excella's rise was facilitated by her total lack of moral constraint. She recognized early on that the future of Tricell lay in the biological research that Umbrella had abandoned. While the older members of the board were content with the profits from shipping and agriculture, Excella saw the biomarket as the only way to achieve the kind of power she craved. She utilized her position as a high-tier executive to establish the African branch of Tricell, turning the continent into her personal laboratory. She was brilliant at navigating the corporate politics of the company, playing different factions against each other, until she was the only one left with the authority to manage the company's most sensitive projects. She believed she was untouchable, a new category of human who was destined to lead the next phase of global evolution. The clinical reality of Excella's rise was her fatal hubris. She believed that she was the one in control, the architect of a new world order that would place her at the apex of human society. She surrounded herself with the trappings of wealth and status, viewing the villagers in Kijuju and even her own staff as inferior units who existed only to serve her vision. This psychological flaw made her the perfect target for someone like Albert Wesker. He recognized that her need for status and her desire for a legacy could be used to fund his own god complex. To Excella, Wesker was a partner who recognized her true worth. To Wesker, she was merely the administrative layer that provided the money and the labs for the Uroboros project. Her rise was the very thing that ensured her eventual destruction. By the time the events of 2009 began, Excella Gionne was the face of Tricell in Africa. She had successfully integrated herself into the highest levels of the global bioweapon market, selling research and data to world governments while finalized the plans for a global saturation. She was the realization of the shadow CEO archetype, a woman who viewed the end of the world as a market opportunity to be managed. Her story is a requiem for the corporate ambition of the mid-2000s, a reminder that when you play with the business of life, you eventually become just another asset to be liquidated. Excella rose to the top of a world that was already rotting from within, and her crown was made of the very viral filaments that would eventually consume her. Excella Gionne did not just want to be wealthy. She wanted to be a deity of the corporate world. Her obsession with power was deeply rooted in a psychological need for status and a desire to be seen as the equal of the world's most powerful figures. She viewed the global elite as her only true peers and possessed a deep clinical contempt for the common population of the planet. To Excella, the billions of people who lived and died in the shadows of the corporate giants were nothing more than biological background noise. This worldview allowed her to oversee the atrocities in Kijuju without a single moment of hesitation or remorse. She believed that the rules of human morality did not apply to someone of her intellect and lineage, and she viewed the Uroboros project as the ultimate tool to enforce her vision of a genetic hierarchy. This obsession made her uniquely vulnerable to the manipulation of Albert Wesker. While Excella was a brilliant corporate strategist, her emotional need for validation from someone she viewed as her superior led her to compromise every safety protocol of the company. She didn't just provide Wesker with money, she provided him with her soul. She believed that by helping him achieve global saturation, she would be elevated to a position of eternal power alongside him. She didn't want the money for its own sake. She wanted the legacy of being the woman who helped save the human species by purging the weak. This psychological flaw turned her into a high-tier asset for Wesker, as she was willing to burn the entire infrastructure of Tricell to ensure his vision was realized. The clinical reality of Excella's obsession was her total isolation. As she climbed the ladder of Tricell, she systematically removed anyone who could challenge her or provide a voice of reason. She lived in a world of luxury and clinical perfection, detached from the visceral horror of the experiments she was funding. She viewed the Magini and the mutated hosts not as tragedies, but as successful data logs. Her obsession with power blinded her to the fact that she was being used. She believed she held leverage over Wesker because she controlled the supply of the drug that stabilized his powers, but she failed to realize that to a man who wanted to be a god, a CEO is just another insect. Her obsession was the engine of her rise, but it was also the primary architect of her downfall. In the final hours of the Kijuju incident, Excella's obsession reached its terminal point. Even as the BSAA was dismantling her facilities and her world was collapsing around her, she remained focused on her status and her partnership with Wesker. She couldn't conceive of a reality where she was not the chosen one. This obsession is what makes her death so symbolic in the archives. She died as a massive, mindless monster, a literal manifestation of the Uroboros that she thought she could control. She was consumed by the very power she had sought, proving that in the biohazard world, the will to power is often just a shortcut to extinction. Excella Gionne was a requiem for the corporate ego, a warning of what happens when the pursuit of status becomes a biological pathogen. The meeting between Tricell and Albert Wesker was not an accident. It was a strategic necessity for both parties. Following the fall of Umbrella in 2003, the bioweapon industry was in a state of chaotic transition. Tricell had the money, the shipping lanes, and the desire to dominate the market, but they lacked a visionary who could bridge the gap between simple viral research and the next stage of human evolution. They needed someone who understood the clinical soul of the Spencer legacy, but possessed the tactical brilliance to avoid Umbrella's mistakes. At the same time, Albert Wesker was the most valuable free agent on the planet. He possessed the data from Raccoon City, the samples of the T and G viruses, and the intimate knowledge of the Progenitor strain. He needed a bank that could fund his high-tier experiments without asking too many questions. Tricell found Wesker through their extensive network of shadow operatives and former Umbrella contacts. They recognized that he was the only individual who could provide the soul for their biological weapons program. The partnership was born of a mutual exploitation. To Tricell's board and to Excella Gionne, Wesker was the key to unlocking the multi-billion-dollar potential of the next generation of pathogens. He provided them with the Las Plagas samples and the refined viral data that allowed them to move beyond the unstable necrotic failures of the 1990s. In return, Tricell provided Wesker with the massive African resources of their pharmaceutical division, including the ancient Stairway to the Sun, ruins where the Progenitor virus originated. The clinical reality of this partnership was a state of permanent tactical tension. Tricell believed they were the ones in control because they provided the infrastructure and the administrative cover for Wesker's work. They viewed him as a high-tier contractor who was providing them with a product to be sold to world governments. Wesker, however, was playing a much deeper game. He utilized Tricell's global shipping network to establish a secret distribution system for the Uroboros pathogen, turning the company's legitimate cargo lanes into the primary vector for a global purge. He maintained the illusion of being a Tricell asset, only as long as he needed their labs to finalize the Uroboros code. He found Tricell not because he wanted a job, but because he wanted an ATM that he could eventually incinerate. The sorrow of this partnership was the total corruption of Tricell's scientific mission. Once Wesker was integrated into the company's African branch, the focus shifted from pharmaceutical progress to global saturation. The legitimate scientists were replaced by Wesker's hand-picked researchers, and the clinics were turned into sorting facilities for the Uroboros filtration. Tricell thought they had found a tool to make them the new kings of the world, but they had actually invited the architect of their own destruction into the boardroom. How Tricell found Wesker is the story of a company that was so blinded by the promise of power that they failed to realize they were being consumed by the very man they thought they were hiring. It was the moment the business of life officially became the business of extinction. One of the most profound misunderstandings in the corporate history of the biohazard world is the belief that Albert Wesker was a Tricell employee. To the outside observer, and even to the Tricell board, Wesker appeared to be the head of the company's pharmaceutical research division in Africa. He wore the suit, he attended the briefings, and he utilized the company's resources to conduct his experiments. However, the internal reality was far different. Wesker never worked for Tricell. He utilized Tricell as a tactical tool to achieve his own transhumanist goals. He viewed the company's massive infrastructure and its global shipping lanes as nothing more than a biological delivery system for the Uroboros pathogen. To Wesker, a corporation was a biological entity to be manipulated, harvested, and discarded once its utility had been exhausted. Wesker maintained the illusion of partnership with Excella Gionne because she provided him with the social and administrative shield he needed to operate in the open. As long as Excella was the face of the project, the international community and the BSAA would view the events in Africa as a corporate crime rather than a global extinction event. He manipulated her romantic and professional attraction to him with a clinical precision, giving her just enough validation to keep the money and the resources flowing. He allowed her to believe that she was his equal, a fellow god in the New World Order, while he was secretly finalizing the plans to erase her and the rest of the Tricell board the moment the Uroboros project reached its terminal phase. The clinical reality of this relationship was the total subversion of Tricell's assets. Wesker bypassed the company's internal security and oversight, establishing his own secret command and control network within the Kijuju labs. He turned Tricell's humanitarian clinics into infection hubs, using the company's legitimate shipping containers to move the Type 2 plagas and the Uroboros filaments across the continent. While the Tricell board thought they were building a market advantage, Wesker was building a planetary filter. He never reported to the board, and he never followed their strategic directives. He was a sovereign entity operating within the shell of a corporation, a parasite that was far more powerful and intelligent than the host it was consuming. The moment the power shifted was the moment the Uroboros pathogen was stabilized. Once Wesker had the finalized virus and the delivery system in place, the corporate side of the operation became an inefficiency. He no longer needed the money, and he no longer needed the administrative cover. He transitioned from the boardroom to the battlefield, without a single word of notice to the Tricell leadership. Wesker's true work was the erasure of the human species, and Tricell was merely the spark that lit the fire. He never worked for them because a man who wants to be a god cannot be an employee. He was the architect, and Tricell was just the raw material that he used to build his throne of black tentacles. The Uroboros pathogen was the ultimate realization of the corporate eugenics philosophy that defined the partnership between Wesker and Tricell. Unlike the T virus, which was an accidental disaster that created a chaotic and unmanageable outbreak, Uroboros was a calculated filter. It was designed with a single clinical goal, which was the selection of superior genetic hosts. Wesker and the Tricell research teams knew from the very beginning that 99.9% of human hosts would be incompatible with the virus. Upon infection, these inferior units would be consumed by the black, oily filaments, turning into mindless, writhing masses of biomass that existed only to consume more organic matter. This wasn't a flaw in the virus's design, it was the entire point. Uroboros was intended to be a global purge that would remove the weak from the population, leaving only a few genetically superior individuals to rule over the remains of the world. This was the ascension that Wesker promised to Excella and the market monopoly that Tricell thought they could manage. The virus was a clinical manifestation of a worldview that viewed the human species as a failed prototype. It was a biological algorithm that scanned the host's DNA and made a binary decision which was either evolve or liquist. This was the ultimate evolution of the Spencer legacy, but stripped of its gothic theatricality and replaced with the cold, mechanical efficiency of a corporate pharmaceutical run. The clinical reality of Uroboros was the sorrow of the filtration process. Those who failed the test were not just killed. They were turned into a biological waste product that served as a distraction for any incoming resistance. The pustule monsters and the massive biomasses encountered by Chris and Sheva in Kijuju were the records of thousands of failed human lives. People who had been deemed incompatible by a virus that had no room for mercy. Tricell's role in this was to manage the sorting facilities, ensuring that the virus was distributed with a level of efficiency that ensured no pocket of humanity remained untouched. They were the ones who turned a planetary-scale genocide into a routine logistics operation. Ultimately, Uroboros was a virus designed to fail the vast majority of the human race. It was the end of history in a glass vial, a weapon that was intended to erase the diversity of the human experience and replace it with a uniform, controlled biological order. Wesker sat at the apex of this hierarchy, a god of the black tentacles, watching as his creation ground the world into a clinical slurry of failed DNA. Uroboros was the final verdict on the business of life, a reminder that when a corporation tries to engineer evolution, the only thing they truly create is a more efficient way to die. It was the perfect bioweapon because it removed the need for a war. It simply made the human race obsolete by design. The selection of Africa as the primary site for Tricell's biological research and the final phase of the Uroboros project was a calculated move based on the clinical exploitation of geography and human vulnerability. Tricell's board and Albert Wesker recognized that the continent provided several tactical advantages that were not available in Europe or North America. First and foremost was the lack of oversight. Many regions in Africa, such as the fictional Kijuju autonomous zone, were suffering from political instability and a lack of centralized military authority. This allowed Tricell to operate with a level of autonomy that would have been impossible in a more developed nation. They could build massive subterranean labs and conduct open-air viral tests without fear of a sudden government raid or a regulatory inspection. Secondly, Africa provided a vulnerable population that could be exploited without the risk of international lawsuits or media attention. Tricell utilized the historical scars of colonialism, setting up humanitarian clinics in poor regions where the people were desperate for any category of medical aid. These villages had no legal recourse and nowhere to run when the vaccines they were given turned out to be the type 2 plagas. Tricell viewed the people of Africa not as citizens, but as low-cost research subjects. They could monitor the mutation velocity and the social collapse of an entire city, like Kijuju, in real time, gathering a level of data that would have taken decades to achieve in a controlled laboratory setting. The clinical reality of this choice was the total exploitation of the global South. Tricell used their humanitarian mask to bypass the moral and ethical constraints of the international community. They were heralded as saviors by the UN and the media, even as they were turning entire provinces into biological exclusion zones. The presence of the Progenitor virus's origin site, the stairway to the sun, ruins, also made Africa a logistical necessity. By controlling the site of the original virus, Tricell held the keys to the entire biohazard world. They didn't have to ship samples from a secret lab. They could harvest the source code directly from the soil and refine it on site. The sorrow of this choice is the reminder that the business of life always preys on the most vulnerable. Africa was chosen not because it was convenient, but because it was invisible to the eyes of the world's elite. Tricell knew that as long as the outbreaks were contained to the African interior, the world would look the other way. They turned an entire continent into a living laboratory, treating the deaths of thousands as a reasonable operational expense. How Africa was chosen is the story of a corporate hierarchy that viewed the world as a game board and the people who lived there as nothing more than the pieces to be sacrificed for the sake of the next market opportunity. It was the ultimate crime of the corporate era, a biological colonization that was far more lethal than anything the 19th century had ever produced. Part 11. Kijuju as a living laboratory. The city of Kijuju represents one of the most horrific examples of corporate malfeasance in the history of the biohazard world. To the public, Kijuju was a thriving regional hub that had benefited immensely from Tricell's massive infrastructure and agricultural investment. However, the internal reality was that Tricell viewed the entire city as a living laboratory, a controlled environment where they could observe the real-world application of the Type 2 plagas and the initial stages of the Uroboros filtration. Unlike a traditional laboratory, where subjects are kept in sterile cages, Kijuju allowed Tricell to monitor how a biological pathogen would move through a dense, active urban population. They intentionally unmanaged the initial outbreaks, watching with clinical detachment as the social order of the city dissolved in a matter of hours. The clinical reality of Kijuju was the total reduction of human life to data points. Tricell's research teams, operating from secure subterranean facilities, utilized the city's surveillance network to record the mutation velocity of the infected villagers. They were not looking to cure the infection. They were looking to refine the hive mind logic of the Type 2 plagas. By observing how the infected civilians coordinated their attacks and maintained a primitive level of social structure, Tricell gathered invaluable data on how to create a controllable biological army. The civilians were no longer patients or citizens. They were organic processing units in a planetary scale experiment. Every scream and every death was logged into the Tricell database as a tactical metric, helping the company to determine the efficiency of their biological products. This living laboratory model allowed Tricell to bypass the limitations of small-scale animal testing. They could see how the virus reacted to different ages, genders, and genetic backgrounds in a single, high-density location. The outbreaks were not accidental leaks, but timed releases, designed to test specific viral strains. Tricell monitored the city's water supply, the food distribution centers, and the medical clinics, using them as primary delivery vectors for the pathogen. By the time the BSAA arrived in 2009, the city was no longer a human settlement. It was a biological ecosystem entirely dictated by Tricell's research objectives. The company had turned the business of life into a totalizing system of urban predation, proving that for the right price, an entire city could be sacrificed for the sake of a corporate balance sheet. The sorrow of Kijuju is the reminder of how easily a community can be dismantled when a corporation controls the infrastructure of its survival. The people of Kijuju had no reason to suspect that the very clinics that provided their medicine were the ones poisoning them. Tricell exploited their trust with a cold, mechanical precision that Umbrella never possessed. While Umbrella was often chaotic and prone to accidents, Tricell was intentional. They wanted the city to fall so they could study the ruins. Kijuju was the final proof that the modern corporation does not seek to serve humanity, but to harvest it. The city's collapse was a requiem for the idea of urban safety, a clinical demonstration of how a global logistics giant can turn a civilization into a slaughterhouse without ever firing a single shot. Part 12. Tricell's role in the global bioweapons market. Tricell's primary innovation in the global bioweapons market was the shift from selling monsters to selling research. In the 1990s, Umbrella's model was focused on the creation and sale of finished biological organic weapons, such as the Tyrant or the Hunter. This was a high-risk business model because a finished monster is a physical piece of evidence that can be traced back to its origin. Tricell realized that the real value lay in the intellectual property and the research data required to create these weapons. They moved the industry into a subscription model where they provided world governments and rogue states with the viral samples, the genetic blueprints, and the technical support needed to start their own secret biological programs. This made Tricell the primary consultant for the apocalypse, a role that allowed them to remain legally untouchable while profiting from every side of a conflict. The clinical reality of this market role was the creation of a biological service economy. Tricell understood that world governments were desperate for the tactical advantages of bioweapons, but were terrified of the international sanctions that would follow a public outbreak. By selling the research instead of the finished product, Tricell provided these governments with the ultimate layer of plausible deniability. The customers could claim that their research was for defensive purposes or vaccine development, while utilizing Tricell's data to build their own offensive arsenals. This strategy ensured that Tricell survived much longer than Umbrella. They were not just a supplier, they were a foundational part of the global security apparatus. They were the ones who wrote the standard operating procedures for the next generation of biological warfare. Furthermore, Tricell's role in the market was protected by their integration into the legitimate global economy. Because they controlled the shipping lanes and the agricultural production of entire regions, they could bake the cost of their biological research into the prices of their consumer goods. They were laundering their bioweapon profits through the sale of wheat, medicine, and humanitarian aid. This made it nearly impossible for international regulators to track their funding. Every time a government bought a shipment of Tricell pharmaceuticals, they were potentially funding the next phase of the Uroboros project. Tricell had successfully turned bioterrorism into a sustainable and professional industry, removing the theatricality of Umbrella and replacing it with the cold efficiency of a Fortune 500 company. The legacy of Tricell's market strategy is the permanent saturation of the world with biological data. Even after the company was officially dissolved post-2009, the research they sold remains in the hands of dozens of national states and shadow organizations. They didn't just leak a virus, they leaked the knowledge of how to create one. This is why the outbreaks of the 2010s and 2020s feel so much more refined and cleaner than the incidents of the 1990s. Tricell taught the world that the most dangerous weapon is not the monster in the cage, but the data on the hard drive. They were the corporation that professionalized extinction, proving that in the modern world, the most successful villain is the one who sells the tools of destruction as a legitimate business service. Part 13. How Tricell learned from Umbrella's mistakes. The rise of Tricell was built on a clinical autopsy of the Umbrella Corporation's catastrophic failure. Tricell's board understood that Umbrella's downfall was not caused by a lack of scientific brilliance, but by a total failure of corporate management and public relations. Umbrella was a centralized, ego-driven empire that operated with a level of theatricality that invited international scrutiny. Tricell's first major adjustment was to eliminate the celebrity scientist culture. In the Umbrella era, researchers like William Birkin and Alexia Ashford were treated like rock stars within the company, often leading to personal vendettas and ego-driven decisions that compromised security. Tricell moved toward a model of anonymous efficiency, where no single researcher held enough power to threaten the company's stability. Their scientists were cogs in a larger machine, their work fragmented so that the big picture was only visible to the highest tier of the board. Secondly, Tricell avoided the mistake of visible branding on their biological assets. Umbrella's desire to put their logo on every briefcase and every laboratory door made them an easy target for investigators and survivors. Tricell operated through a web of shell companies and unbranded containers. If a Tricell shipment of Type 2 plagas was intercepted, there was no red and white logo to tie it back to the parent company. They utilized their legitimate shipping and agricultural divisions to provide the perfect cover, moving viral samples in containers labeled as fertilizer or emergency medical supplies. This plausible deniability was not just a tactic, it was a foundational philosophy. They realized that in the 21st century, the most successful corporation is the one that is invisible to the eyes of the public, while being essential to the functioning of the state. The clinical reality of this strategy was a total lack of emotional attachment to their biological assets. Umbrella often spent millions of dollars and years of research trying to perfect a single tyrant or a specific viral strain, leading them to take unnecessary risks to protect those assets when a facility was compromised. Tricell viewed their biological products as disposable operational expenses. If a lab in Africa was discovered by the BSAA, Tricell's policy was to erase the facility and all personnel within it, rather than risk a leak that could lead back to the board. They had no pride in their monsters. They only had interest in the data they produced. This cold mechanical approach allowed them to survive in a world of high-speed data and international oversight that would have destroyed Umbrella in a matter of months. Finally, Tricell learned that the most effective way to manage a biohazard is to be the one who provides the solution. While Umbrella tried to cover up their leaks with secret task forces, Tricell moved into the open as the saviors of the region. They provided the vaccines, the medical clinics, and the humanitarian aid in the wake of an outbreak, effectively profiting from the very disasters they created. They realized that by controlling the intervention, they could control the evidence. This was the ultimate evolution of corporate survival. They didn't just replace Umbrella, they perfected the model of the corporate predator. They proved that the only thing more profitable than starting a fire is being the only company that sells the water to put it out. Part 14. The myth of corporate control. The relationship between Excella Gionne and Albert Wesker was built on the myth of corporate control. Excella, as a high-tier executive of Tricell, believed that she held the ultimate leverage over Wesker because she controlled the massive financial and logistical resources of the company. She viewed Wesker as a visionary asset, a brilliant tool that she could manage through a combination of professional partnership and personal manipulation. She believed that as long as she controlled his supply of PG67AW, the drug required to stabilize his superhuman powers, Wesker would remain loyal to her and to the Tricell mission. This was a clinical failure of judgment. Excella failed to realize that to a man who viewed himself as a god, the concept of corporate hierarchy was an irrelevance. Wesker was not a partner. He was a parasite that had already consumed the host. The clinical reality of this power dynamic was that Wesker had already shifted the center of power from the boardroom to the battlefield long before the Kijuju incident reached its peak. He utilized Tricell's resources to build a private infrastructure that was entirely loyal to him, bypassing the company's internal security and oversight. While Excella was giving briefings to the Tricell board about market expansion and biological assets, Wesker was finalizing the plans for a global saturation that would render the concept of a market obsolete. He allowed Excella to maintain the illusion of control only as long as he needed her administrative signature to move the Uroboros samples across international borders. The moment the virus was stabilized, the corporate side of the operation became an operational inefficiency that Wesker was ready to liquidate. Furthermore, the myth of control was exposed by Wesker's total indifference to Tricell's financial health. A corporation operates on the logic of profit and sustainability, but Wesker operated on the logic of genetic purge. He had no interest in the long-term survival of Tricell as a business entity. He was using the company's global shipping network to establish the delivery nodes for the Uroboros pathogen, turning the company's legitimate assets into the primary vector for human extinction. Excella's belief that she could lead the next phase of evolution alongside him was a psychological delusion fueled by her own hubris. She didn't realize that in Wesker's vision of the world, there was no room for a CEO. There was only the god and the filtered remains of the species. The sorrow of this myth is the speed with which it shattered. In the final hours of the Kijuju incident, as the BSAA was closing in, Excella realized that her control was a legal fiction. Wesker didn't need her to manage the labs, and he didn't need her to provide the serum. He had already harvested everything he needed from Tricell. He infected Excella with the very virus she helped fund, turning his partner into a massive mindless monster to serve as a distraction. This was the final verdict on corporate control in the biohazard world. It proves that no matter how much money or infrastructure a corporation possesses, they are powerless against a biological threat that has outgrown its leash. Excella thought she was a queen, but she was just another data point in Wesker's final experiment. Part 15. The Kijuju Collapse. The collapse of Tricell's African branch during the Kijuju incident of 2009 was a masterclass in corporate unraveling. When the BSAA operatives Chris Redfield and Shiva Alamar began their investigation, the humanitarian facade of the company evaporated in a matter of hours. The transition from a respected conglomerate to a fugitive entity was total. As the scale of the Uroboros and Type 2 Plagas outbreaks became undeniable, the internal panic within Tricell's local leadership reached terminal levels. Executives who had spent years overseeing the exploitation of the region suddenly realized that no rescue was coming. Tricell's global headquarters in Europe, true to their policy of plausible deniability, immediately began to erase all digital and physical links to the Kijuju branch, writing off thousands of employees and millions in assets as operational expenses to save the parent company. The clinical reality of the collapse was a state of total abandonment. The low-level staff, the security guards, and the junior researchers were left to be consumed by the very biological weapons they had helped create. Tricell's high-tier enforcers were ordered to initiate scorched earth protocols, destroying research data and killing any witnesses who could tie the outbreaks back to the board. This was the umbrella lesson in action. Tricell would rather burn a continent than face a courtroom. The Kijuju branch was effectively liquidated in the most literal sense, turned into a war zone of black tentacles and mindless Magini. The sorrow of the collapse was the realization that in the eyes of the corporation, the employees were as disposable as the villagers they had experimented on. Furthermore, the collapse revealed the fragility of the corporate model when faced with a true biological god. Albert Wesker's total subversion of Tricell's assets meant that when the end came, the company had no way to defend itself. Wesker had turned the company's own laboratories into his personal fortress, using Tricell's resources to fund his escape on the Uroboros bomber. The corporation that had spent years trying to control the biohazard world found itself being used as a shield by its own contractor. The Kijuju collapse was the moment the world realized that Tricell was not the successor to Umbrella, but a more efficient version of the same failure. They had built a machine of genocide, and they were the first ones to be crushed by its gears. The legacy of the Kijuju collapse is the total destruction of Tricell's public reputation. While the global parent company attempted to distance itself from the rogue actions in Africa, the scale of the evidence provided by the BSAA was too great to ignore. The collapse marked the end of the era of the visible corporate villain. After 2009, the industry moved even further into the shadows, adopting the shell company model of Neo Umbrella and the connections. Tricell's fall was a requiem for the idea that a corporation could hide its crimes behind a humanitarian banner indefinitely. In the end, the Kijuju branch was just a pile of ash and black biomass, a fitting monument to a company that thought it could own the end of the world. Part 16. Excella's final mistake. The death of Excella Gionne is perhaps the most symbolic and ironic moment in the entire history of corporate bioterrorism. Throughout her rise within Tricell, Excella operated under the delusion that she was a chosen successor to the Spencer legacy. She believed that her beauty, her intellect, and her elite lineage made her the only person capable of ruling the new world, alongside Albert Wesker. Her final mistake was the fundamental misunderstanding of Wesker's character and his vision for the Uroboros pathogen. She viewed Uroboros as a tool of corporate consolidation, a way to remove her rivals and cement her power. She failed to realize that to Wesker, she was just as inferior as the villagers in Kijuju she looked down upon. She was not a partner. She was a host, a unit of biological material to be used and discarded. The clinical reality of her death was a state of total betrayal. In her final moments on the Tricell oil tanker, Excella was not given a seat on the throne of the New World. She was given a dose of the Uroboros virus. Wesker utilized his partner as a tactical distraction, infecting her to create a massive biomass that would slow down Chris Redfield and Shiva Alomar. The transformation was agonizing and dehumanizing, turning the woman who prized her status and beauty above all else into a mindless, writhing mass of black filaments. She became the very thing she had spent years researching, a failed filter. Her death was a clinical demonstration of Wesker's total contempt for the human species, regardless of their corporate rank or genetic pedigree. Furthermore, Excella's death symbolized the total failure of the corporate eugenics philosophy. She believed that she could engineer a world that would benefit people like her, but she failed to realize that a virus like Uroboros has no respect for social hierarchies. In the face of a true biological predator, a CEO is no different from a commoner. Her death was the ultimate liquidation of Tricell's African leadership. She died as a monster, a literal manifestation of the greed and hubris that had driven her to the top of the company. The sorrow of her end is found in her final, desperate cries for Wesker, a man who had already forgotten her name before the first tentacle even emerged from her chest. The legacy of Excella's final mistake is a warning to all who seek to partner with the architects of extinction. She thought she was the one holding the leash, but she was the one wearing the collar. This part of the archive documents the specific neural and physical collapse of a woman who traded her humanity for a crown of black biomass. She was the last high-tier executive of the old corporate model, and her death marked the end of the boardroom era of bioterrorism. After Excella, the villains of the Resident Evil world became more shadow-like, more ideological, and far less concerned with the trappings of corporate status. She was a requiem for the ego of the 21st century executive, a woman who thought she could own the end of the world and found out she was just the fuel for its fire. Part 17. Tricell's official end. Following the catastrophic events of the Kijuju incident in 2009 and the subsequent global saturation threat by Albert Wesker, the Tricell Corporation faced a level of international scrutiny that made its continued operation impossible. The official narrative pushed by world governments and the United Nations was that Tricell had been dissolved and its leadership prosecuted for crimes against humanity. To the public, it appeared that the monster had been slain once again, and that the Tricell name had joined umbrella in the dustbin of corporate history. This narrative was reinforced by high-profile trials and the seizure of Tricell's visible assets across Europe and North America. It was a legal fiction designed to satisfy the public's demand for justice, while allowing the underlying biological infrastructure to remain intact. The clinical reality of Tricell's end was a massive corporate shell game. While the Tricell brand was officially retired, the company's vast resources, data, and personnel did not simply disappear. The board members, who were not directly implicated in the Kijuju incident, utilized their decentralized structure to move their biological assets into a web of new shell companies and independent research branches. The end of Tricell was merely a rebranding operation. The intellectual property that Wesker had refined, including the Uroboros data and the Type 2 plagas research, was secretly absorbed by world governments and private interests who were still desperate for a biological edge. Tricell didn't die. It fractured into a dozen smaller, more dangerous entities that operated without the burden of a public name. Furthermore, the official end of Tricell was a masterclass in bureaucratic damage control. The BSAA and other international agencies were forced to participate in the cover-up to prevent a global panic about the scale of the corruption. If the public realized that a company as large as Tricell was fundamentally integrated into the world's bioweapon market, the entire global economic system would have collapsed. The sorrow of this period was the realization that the justice served was purely theatrical. The low-level staff went to prison, while the high-tier architects of the disaster moved their bank accounts to offshore tax havens and continued their work under new banners. Tricell's end proved that in the 21st century, a corporation is a hydra. You can cut off the head, but the body will simply grow new ones in the shadows. The legacy of the official end is the creation of the black budget era of bioterrorism. After 2009, the industry moved away from large, visible conglomerates like Tricell and toward the decentralized model of the connections and neo-umbrella. The professional era that Tricell had built was now self-sustaining, operating within the blind spots of the international legal system. The public was told that the world was safe, but the archives proved that the DNA of Tricell's research continued to drive every major incident in the following decade. The official end was the final lie of the 2009 era, a clinical rebranding of an apocalypse that was still in progress. Tricell had successfully evolved beyond the need for a name, becoming a permanent and invisible part of the global biological landscape. Part 18. The Assets That Vanished. When the news of the Kijuju incident broke and the official shutdown of Tricell began, billions of dollars in research data, viral samples, and high-tier personnel simply vanished into the digital and physical ether. This was not a chaotic collapse, but a calculated extraction conducted by the company's shadow directors. They understood that the most valuable part of Tricell was not the buildings or the ships, but the intellectual property it held. As the BSAA raided the visible facilities, they found mostly sanitized servers and empty storage vats. The real assets had already been moved into a web of black budget accounts and untraceable shell companies across the globe. The Uroboros data, the Las Plagas refinements, and the Progenitor source code were refiled under new designations that even the highest tier of the BSAA could not access. The clinical reality of these vanished assets was the creation of a global biological black market that was far more sophisticated than anything that had existed after the fall of Umbrella. Tricell had professionalized the industry, and their closing sale was a windfall for rogue states and private military contractors. The viral samples were not destroyed, they were recycled into new projects. This is why the pathogens encountered in later incidents, such as the C virus in Tall Oaks and the mold in Louisiana, carry the clear DNA of Tricell's research into genetic compatibility and viral stability. Nothing was lost. It was simply redistributed to those who were willing to pay the price. The assets that vanished were the seeds of the next 20 years of horror. Furthermore, the vanished assets included the high-tier scientific minds who had spent years working for Tricell. These researchers, who possessed a level of biological expertise that was unmatched in the legitimate world, were headhunted by organizations like Neo Umbrella and the Connections. They didn't stop their work. They simply changed the color of their lab coats. This brain drain into the shadow world ensured that the cycle of bioterrorism would continue indefinitely. Tricell had built a scientific infrastructure that outlived the company itself. The vanishing of these assets was the final verdict on the 2009 era. It proved that you cannot kill a corporation that has already turned its crimes into intellectual property. The sorrow of the vanished assets is the realization of the absolute futility of the Kijuju mission. While Chris and Sheva stopped the Uroboros launch, they couldn't stop the market that Wesker and Tricell had built. The assets that vanished represent the shadow legacy of the 21st century. They are the reason why the Resident Evil world is in a state of permanent biological instability. Tricell's end was a clinical liquidation of a brand, but the business of life continued without interruption. The vanished assets are the real story of the post-2009 world, a reminder that in a world of corporate shadow games, the only thing that truly disappears is the truth. Part 19. Tricell's scientists after RE9. The scientific minds that drove the Tricell biological weapons program did not face the justice they deserved in the aftermath of the 2009 incident. Instead, they became the most sought-after commodities in the global shadow market. These individuals possessed a clinical understanding of directed evolution and viral symbiosis that world governments and rogue organizations were desperate to acquire. As Tricell was officially dissolved, a high-tier headhunting operation was initiated by organizations like Neo Umbrella, The Connections, and various black-budget government agencies. The scientists who had worked on the Uroboros project were not viewed as criminals. They were viewed as biological assets whose knowledge was essential for the next generation of bioweapons warfare. The clinical reality of these scientists' post-2009 lives was a move into total deniability. They were given new identities, new laboratories, and unlimited funding to continue their research under different banners. This is why the outbreaks in the 2010s, such as the C virus incident, displayed a level of corporate precision that was characteristic of Tricell's methodology. The scientists brought with them the decentralized philosophy they had learned at Tricell, ensuring that the new research hubs were even harder to find and destroy. They didn't stop their work, they simply refined it. They moved away from the messy, viral blooms of the past and toward the creation of designer pathogens that could be used for specific tactical objectives. Furthermore, the absorption of Tricell's scientists into the global security apparatus created a conflict of interest that permanently compromised the world's biohazard response. Many of these researchers ended up working for the very organizations that were supposed to be monitoring for new threats. This allowed them to hide in plain sight, using their positions of authority to steer investigations away from their new projects. The sorrow of this period was the realization that the world's defense against bioterrorism was being managed by the same people who had helped create it. Tricell's scientific legacy was a virus of the mind, a philosophy of biological dominance that had successfully infected every level of global power. The legacy of Tricell's scientists is a world of cleaner and more efficient horror. They taught the industry how to remove the ego from the science, moving away from the celebrity scientist model and toward a model of collaborative, anonymous research. This ensured that no matter how many labs were raided, the underlying knowledge would survive. The scientists who survived the Kijuju collapse were the architects of the new world order of bioterrorism. They proved that a mind is the most dangerous biological asset of all, a weapon that cannot be neutralized by a gunshot or a nuclear strike. Tricell's scientists were the ones who ensured that the business of life would never truly die. It would only become more professional. Part 20. Tricell's influence on later bioterror. The influence of Tricell on the subsequent era of global bioterrorism cannot be overstated. While Umbrella provided the raw materials of the 1990s, Tricell provided the operational blueprint for the 21st century. After 2009, the industry moved away from large, visible conglomerates and toward the ghost network model of shadow organizations. Every major incident in the modern era, from the Tall Oaks outbreak to the Dulvey incident in Louisiana, carries the DNA of Tricell's professionalism and corporate efficiency. They were the ones who moved the industry away from leaking mansions and toward global saturation tactics, proving that the most effective way to deploy a bioweapon is through the existing infrastructure of the global economy. The clinical reality of this influence is a state of silent saturation. Post-2009 threats feel cleaner because they are designed to be integrated into the human social and biological fabric. The C virus, for example, utilized the high mutation velocity data that Tricell gathered from the Kijuju Magini, allowing for the creation of Javo soldiers who could adapt to the battlefield in real time. The mold research conducted by the Connections utilized Tricell's data on genetic compatibility, focusing on the creation of a hive mind that could be used to subvert entire populations. Tricell didn't just sell a virus, they sold a philosophy of biological control that has become the standard for every villain in the series' modern history. Furthermore, Tricell's influence is seen in the decentralization of the threat. Modern villains no longer seek to build a central empire. They seek to establish nodes of infection that can operate independently. This is a direct evolution of Tricell's rogue branch model. It makes the threat nearly impossible to destroy, as there is no central head to cut off. The sorrow of the post-Tricell world is the realization that the war has become a war of attrition. The heroes of the BSAA are fighting a losing battle against a decentralized industry that has turned human life into a market opportunity. Tricell's ghost still haunts every board meeting of the shadow organizations that seek to weaponize life itself. The final verdict on Tricell's influence is that they were the bridge between the old world of Umbrella and the new world of systemic biological collapse. They proved that bioterrorism is not a disaster to be survived, but a market to be managed. Their legacy is a world where the air we breathe and the food we eat are potential vectors for the next strategic deployment. Tricell didn't just replace Umbrella, they evolved it into a form that is harder to find, harder to fight, and much harder to forget. Every major biohazard incident in the modern era is a requiem for the corporate efficiency that Tricell introduced to the world in 2009. They were the architects of a permanent apocalypse, and we are still living in the ruins of their business plan. Part 21. Tricell versus Umbrella. When we place the histories of Umbrella and Tricell side by side for a clinical comparison, we are looking at two fundamentally different philosophies of biological horror. Umbrella, founded in the late 1960s by Oswell Spencer, was a company built on the aesthetic of chaos. Their research was often theatrical and experimental, driven by the individual egos of celebrity scientists like Marcus, Birkin, and Ashford. The disasters associated with Umbrella, most notably the Arklay Mansion and the Raccoon City incident, were largely defined by accidental leaks, technical failures, and the total breakdown of centralized control. Umbrella was a Victorian-era dinosaur trying to navigate the high-tech world of the late 20th century, and its eventual collapse was as dramatic and messy as the viruses it produced. Tricell, however, was a corporation built on the principle of precision. They moved the industry away from the unpredictable, accidental model and into the era of intentional genocide, where Umbrella produced a shambling zombie that was a mistake of containment. Tricell produced a Magini that was a masterpiece of tactical subversion. Tricell's research was not about creating a monster that could survive a lab accident. It was about creating a biological algorithm that could filter a global population according to a specific genetic criteria. This shift from chaos to precision made Tricell a far more lethal entity. While Umbrella caused more immediate, visible destruction through the lens of a single city, Tricell caused more long-term damage by turning bioterrorism into a professional, sustainable service that could be integrated into the existing global economy. The clinical reality of this comparison is the difference between a disaster and a system. Umbrella was a disaster that could be stopped by a nuclear strike or a legal trial. Tricell was a system that was too deeply integrated into the world's vital infrastructure to be easily excised. If you destroyed an Umbrella facility, the threat in that region usually ended. If you destroyed a Tricell facility in Kijuju, the research data had already been backed up to a dozen different nodes across the globe through their shipping networks. Tricell learned that the real value of a bioweapon was not its physical strength, but its marketability as an intellectual property. They stopped being a pharmaceutical company and became a biological logistics giant, a move that allowed them to outlive the legacy of Spencer by nearly a decade. The sorrow of this comparison is found in the refinement of cruelty. Umbrella's victims were the collateral damage of a company that didn't know how to handle its own power. Tricell's victims were the calculated costs of a company that knew exactly what it was doing. Tricell utilized the data of the Raccoon City incident, not as a warning, but as a user manual for their own filtration projects. They viewed the human species with a cold, mechanical detachment that even the most sociopathic Umbrella scientist would have envied. Umbrella was a monster that didn't know its own strength. Tricell was a predator that had studied the anatomy of its prey for years before making the first move. In the final audit of history, Umbrella will be remembered as the prototype, but Tricell will be remembered as the final version of corporate evil. Part 22. Why Tricell was more dangerous than Umbrella. The reason Tricell was significantly more dangerous than the Umbrella Corporation lies in its structural invisibility. Umbrella was a pharmaceutical giant that wore its power on its sleeve, making it an easy target for whistleblowers, media investigations, and international sanctions. Tricell, however, was integrated into the circulatory system of the global economy. Because they controlled the primary shipping lanes and the agricultural production of entire continents, they were effectively too big to fail. You could not simply shut down Tricell without risking a global food crisis or a total collapse of the international transport network. This gave them a level of political and economic immunity that Oswald Spencer could only dream of. They were not a wound on the world that could be healed. They were a cancer that had become part of the body. The clinical reality of Tricell's danger was their ability to militarize the mundane. They didn't need a secret mansion in the woods to hide their research. They hid it in the holds of thousands of commercial cargo ships moving between Raccoon City, Europe, and Africa. They turned the very tools of modern civilization, global trade, and humanitarian aid into the primary vectors for biological warfare. This made the threat nearly impossible to detect through traditional means. A crate labeled as rice or antibiotics could easily contain the refined filaments of the Uroboros or the eggs of the type 2 plagas. Tricell proved that the most effective way to destroy the world is to use the world's own logistics as the weapon. This was a level of strategic sophistication that bypassed every biohazard sensor and every border security protocol of the mid-2000s. Furthermore, Tricell was more dangerous because they were less about ego and more about results. While Umbrella scientists were often distracted by their own quest for personal godhood or family legacies, Tricell's research teams were driven by the cold logic of project milestones and market saturation. They didn't care about the poetry of the virus. They cared about its deployment efficiency. This lack of emotional attachment made them much harder to stop. If a project was failing, they didn't double down out of pride. They liquidated the assets and moved on to the next research node. This clinical flexibility ensured that their biological work was always evolving at a speed that the BSAA struggled to keep up with. They were a professional apocalypse conducted with the precision of a pharmaceutical manufacturing run. The legacy of Tricell's danger is the institutionalization of bioterrorism. They proved that you don't need a secret society to end the world. You just need a board of directors who view extinction as a reasonable trade-off for market dominance. They were the ones who moved the series away from monster of the week horror and into the realm of systemic dread. Tricell was the blueprint for the villains of the next 20 years, showing that the real enemy is not the one with the claws, but the one with the contract. They were more dangerous than Umbrella because they were smarter, more patient, and far more integrated into the lives of the people they intended to destroy. Tricell was the definitive proof that in a world of global corporations, the individual human life is nothing more than an operational expense to be managed and eventually written off. Part 23. Tricell as the blueprint for modern villains. The fallout of the 2009 Kijuju incident and the collapse of Tricell established the definitive blueprint for the modern villain in the Resident Evil universe. After the world saw how a global logistics giant could hide a planetary extinction event behind a humanitarian banner, the era of the visible lab coat was officially over. Tricell proved that the most effective way to conduct biological warfare was through shadow factions and institutional capture. Every major antagonist that followed, from Carla Radams and Neo Umbrella to the connections in Louisiana, utilized the Tricell model of decentralization, plausible deniability, and the exploitation of existing social and economic infrastructures. Tricell moved the series away from corporate greed and toward ideological control, setting the stage for a world where the monsters are no longer the product but the enforcers of a new biological order. The clinical reality of this blueprint is the shell company philosophy. Tricell taught future villains that a single name is a liability. Modern organizations like the Connections operate as a web of unbranded nodes, making them nearly impossible for the BSAA to target in a single operation. They learned from Tricell that the real power lies in the data and the scientists, both of which can be moved across borders in a matter of hours. This has turned the biohazard threat into a global guerrilla war of biology. The villains no longer seek to build a central empire. They seek to establish infection hubs that can trigger a local disaster to harvest data for the next phase of a global project. Tricell was the first to realize that you don't need to win a war if you can control the biological narrative of the aftermath. Furthermore, Tricell established the archetype of the ideological CEO. Excella Gionne was not just looking for money. She was looking for a new world where she would be a god. This shift from profit to ideology is what defines the modern Resident Evil villain. Whether it is Mother Miranda's quest for family, or the Connection's quest for a perfect biological vessel like Eveline, the goal is always a fundamental rewrite of the human condition. Tricell provided the bridge between the simple wealth of the 20th century and the transhumanism of the 21st. They proved that the most dangerous weapon is not a virus, but an idea that has been backed by a multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical budget. The modern villain is a product of Tricell's corporate efficiency, a creature that views the human race not as customers, but as raw material for a more perfected category of existence. The sorrow of this blueprint is the realization that the world is now trapped in a cycle of permanent biological insecurity. Because Tricell professionalized the industry, there is no longer a way to win the war against bioterrorism. You can only manage the symptoms. Tricell's legacy is a world where every medical clinic and every shipping container is a potential site of a new nightmare. They turned the apocalypse into a business plan that has been adopted by every shadow power on the planet. Tricell may be gone, but the Tricell way is still the standard for everyone who seeks to weaponize life. They were the architects of the modern era, the ones who taught the world that the only thing more profitable than life is the ability to decide exactly how it ends. Part 24. Final verdict. Umbrella never really died. The final verdict on the history of Tricell and its relationship to the biohazard world is the chilling realization that the Umbrella Corporation never truly died. While the Umbrella name was officially buried in 2003, the Umbrella philosophy, the belief that life is a resource to be weaponized and that evolution can be forced through a laboratory, simply evolved into a more sophisticated and dangerous form. Tricell was not a replacement for Umbrella. It was the next stage of its evolution. The red and white logo may have vanished from the buildings, but the biological soul of Oswell Spencer's vision was transferred directly into the boardrooms of Tricell. They took the chaotic failures of the 1990s and turned them into the clinical genocides of the mid-2000s. The clinical reality of this final verdict is that bioterrorism has become a permanent, institutionalized part of the corporate landscape. Tricell proved that you can bankrupt a company, but you cannot bankrupt an industry that has become essential to the global security and economic apparatus. The Umbrella era was the era of the accidental outbreak. The Tricell era was the era of the intentional selection. We are now living in the shadow era, where the research conducted in Kijuju and the data harvested from the Uroboros project continues to drive every major incident in the modern world. The legacy of Raccoon City is not a cautionary tale. It is the source code for the next generation of bioweapons. Umbrella never died because the world never truly stopped wanting what they were selling. Furthermore, the final verdict is that the human race has fundamentally lost its war against the biohazard. Because organizations like Tricell successfully integrated biological research into the vital infrastructure of civilization, there is no longer a way to separate progress from extinction. Every pharmaceutical breakthrough and every agricultural innovation now carries the DNA of a potential weapon. Tricell's end in 2009 was merely a rebranding of a disaster that is still in progress. The true horror of the Resident Evil universe is not the monster in the dark, but the realization that the world we built to protect us is the one that is systematically dismantling us. Umbrella was the spark, but Tricell was the fire that turned the world into a global laboratory. Ultimately, the story of Tricell is a requiem for the idea of corporate morality. It is a reminder that in a world where life is a product, death is merely a market adjustment. Tricell didn't just replace Umbrella, they perfected it. They moved the threat from the shadows into the boardroom, proving that the ultimate biohazard is the human desire for absolute control. As long as there is a corporation willing to view a global purge as a market opportunity, Umbrella will never truly be dead. The logo may change, the villains may hide behind new names, but the business of life continues to grind the world into a slurry of failed DNA. Tricell was the bridge to this permanent nightmare. The corporation that proved that once you weaponize life, the apocalypse is just another day at the office.